Before we get started, I wanted to let you know about a few events that we've got coming up. Our next brown bag is going to be on August 26th, featuring Sarah Juliet Lauro, who's here at the back of the room, and she's going to be discussing her topic, Monumental, Commemorations of Enslaved Resistance. And on September 24th, we've got Sandra Patton Imani. She has not arrived yet, but she's going to be here discussing her topic, Anne Fairfax Washington Lee, Race, Gender, and Sex in the 18th Century Virginia. We have a lunch at the library on September 10th with Jennifer London, who's going to be discussing her new book, Profiles in Character, 16 Americans and the Traits That Define Them. And our next evening book talk is going to be on September 12th. Our own executive director, Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, is going to be here talking about her brand new book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents That Forged the Republic. And so now I want to introduce today's guest speaker. Meg Roberts is a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge in England. Her dissertation explores the lives, networks, and practices of caregivers during the American Revolutionary War. Throughout her 3-month fellowship, Meg has utilized the resources here at Mount Vernon to enhance her research in interpretation of women in the 18th century and the role they played during the American Revolution. So please join me in a warm welcome for Meg Roberts.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephen. Can you hear me if I'm standing here? Is that all good? Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much, Mount Vernon, for offering me this fellowship. It has been the perfect use of my summer 6 months out from PhD submission. I wouldn't have done any work otherwise. It's been fantastic, and I've already used so many of the resources. The Revolutionary War materials in this institution are incredible. It's nothing like I could get in the UK. It's really been so valuable to my experience and the amount that I'm able to learn. I've also been chatting with historic trades and have learned how to spin yarn. So that's a fantastic bonus. Very excited about it. Thank you. So I'm here today to talk about my dissertation generally, but I'm going to be focusing on nurses and nurses within the Continental Army, which is sort of one section of my dissertation and the one I've been thinking about quite a lot while I've been here. Especially because it's an area that Washington has the most influence over policy. And I'm still kind of working out where Washington fits into all of this, what sort of preconceptions of labor that he's bringing to the Continental Army hospital structure. And I'm talking to various people at Mount Vernon. I'm still learning all of these influences. So if anyone thinks of anything and is that reminds me of George Washington wrote this letter one time, please let me know, because I'm in the process of incorporating all of that. But more generally, my dissertation is looking at the Revolutionary War as a health crisis rather than just a sort of social, political, military crisis. I'm analyzing how early American caregiving networks and labor regimes sort of impacted the progression of the war and caregivers themselves, and kind of interrogating the idea that of including caregiving as a form of coerced labor when we think about different sort of labor regimes, such as enslavement and indentured servitude and sort of precarious wage work. So I'm going to get started. In the autumn of 1776, the Continental Army faced a nursing crisis. Over the summer, the 7,000 soldiers stationed in and around New York and Brooklyn had overwhelmed the city's sanitation systems, and weeks of stifling heat had exacerbated a violent outbreak of dysentery and typhoid fever. As army leaders prepared for a British attack on the city, approximately 1/3 of their forces were unfit for duty, with some regiments lacking any healthy field officers. Officers constantly assessed and reassessed soldiers' capacity for battle in the hope of maintaining a force of able-bodied men fit to stave off the imminent British advance. Meanwhile, the Army Hospital Department's efforts to recruit local women to work as nurses was not going to plan. General Nathaniel Greene complained of, quote, the sick being numerous in the hospital and but few women nurses to be had. He resorted to substituting female nurses with enlisted men who were well enough to perform basic caregiving tasks. In July, the Fort George General Hospital recorded 106 men for nurses caring for almost 1,500 sick soldiers from 21 regiments. Anticipating high pressure on the rudimental regimental hospitals following a battle, officers discharged any sick soldiers who could make their way home. Left without care, they allegedly became, quote, sad spectacles of human woe, presenting themselves in towns, villages, and on the roads and straggling through the country. When the British finally landed in Brooklyn at the end of August, the depleted force buckled. Between 1,000 and 3,000 Continental soldiers were wounded. Whilst organising the evacuation, I've gone too far, ahead too far. I'm going to get the meme back in a minute. Whilst organising the evacuation of his remaining Continental troops under continued bombardment, George Washington wrote to the Continental Congress on the 14th of September in desperation. Like Greene, he reported that the nurses were extremely difficult to procure. Indeed, they are not to be got. He attributed their reluctance to the pay now allowed to nurses for their attendance on the sick, which was by no means adequate to their services. In consequence, he despaired, we are under the necessity of substituting in their place a number of men from the respective regiments, whose service by that means is entirely lost in the proper line of their duty and with little benefit rendered to the sick. The loss of able-bodied men to the caregiving roles signified to Washington that the shortage of nurses had reached crisis point. Claiming to be willing to do whatever humanity or policy can require to make his ailing soldiers more comfortable, he requested that Congress raise nurses' wages from $50 to a still extremely low $1 a week. The Continental Army's low estimation of women's nursing labour would continue to imperil the care for their sick and wounded soldiers for the remainder of the Revolutionary War. Try as they might, Army leaders could never find an effective incentive to counter women's reluctance to work for the hospital department as nurses. Washington's letter to Congress in September of 1776 was the first of many. He would continue to suggest raising nurses' wages further, but increasingly lost patience and began impressing women from the Army community and even threatening to withhold their rations unless they nursed. He doesn't come off great in this, so apologies in advance. He's definitely not the only one sort of suggesting all of these things among the Army leaders and physicians. The severity of the wartime health crisis peaked and troughed over the years according to varying levels of combat, epidemic, sanitation, resources, and season. But nursing labour would underpin the survival of every sick and wounded soldier throughout the eight years of conflict. If we can define a care crisis by a demand for care outweighing the effective supply of care labour, Continental Army leaders' increasingly desperate efforts to engage, incentivize, and coerce nurses over the 8 years of the Revolutionary War suggests the presence of a relentless care crisis. Here we go. So why do we know so little about nurses? Essentially, we don't have many sources at all. I'm really, the whole process of this dissertation has been trying to find one mention in thousands of words and thousands of documents. Partly this is because of the nature of nursing work itself. I've got some examples up here. I'm going to go into more detail about like what nursing involved later. But 18th century writers could be relatively candid about bodies and dirt, but written evidence of caregiving is sparse, primarily because it was usually performed by housewives, children, and precariously employed, indentured, or enslaved women. The type of labor they were doing doesn't really leave a paper trail. They were essentially too busy to be writing down every time they're sort of emptying a chamber pot or clearing, like changing linens or doing the laundry. We get sort of occasional references in housewives' letters to each other, but it's really kind of scraping the barrel. Their constant occupation in this strenuous and relentless labour only exacerbated their archival silence, which has really restricted historians' access to their experiences. In stark contrast, the sheer volume of military documentation produced in the Revolutionary War offers rich detail in spades. The administration of the Continental Army Hospital Department alone created an extensive paper trail. Washington himself exchanged frequent letters with various physicians and army leaders, desperately trying to find solutions to cope with the scale of injury and epidemic among the soldiers. It's precisely because the military archive is so extensive and detailed that the areas where it's silent become more glaring. So usually these omissions are more unthinking than purposeful. So recently I found a new account book for a hospital in Boston where surgeons and surgeons' mates are listed and paid individually, so we can see the names and identities of all of them and kind of dig further into who they were, whereas nurses' wages are merged into one line, a total amount described as pay for sundry nurses, which isn't very helpful at all. But sometimes it seems like physicians were like actively writing nurses out of the historical record. There's cases where hospital returns list that nurses were present at the sort of aftermath of particular battles, but the journals of surgeons and mates from those same battles only describe their own labor. One particularly glaring example is in preparation for the siege of Boston, John Morgan, the then Surgeon General, was desperately recruiting local women as nurses to donate and prepare bandages. But then a year later, in his retelling of this event in a report to Congress, he writes the women out of the event, claiming to have personally prepared 6,000 bandages with the help of a few surgeons and mates. And sometimes they're actively avoiding making records just out of convenience. So the eventual Surgeon General, John Cochrane, at the end of the war, is asked by Congress to prepare a full list of hospital employees' names. And he essentially replies saying, like, okay, cool, I'll get you all of the names of everyone in the hospital department. I'm assuming you don't mean all of the names of the nurses. And that would be so difficult to track down. Like, if I have to, then I will. But I'm assuming you don't mean that, and Congress does mean that, and it's we get sort of partial records because of it. And we only have one official document that's actually outlining the responsibility of hospital nurses, so you have to do a lot of contextualizing. The sources that we do have also don't portray women engaging with the army in a positive light. Continental Army leaders' approach to the recruitment of nurses could turn on a dime, alternating between desperate attempts to entice women into service and condemning their reluctance with threats and ultimatums. Army leaders and physicians were clearly uncomfortable with their dependence on nurses, partly due to the nature of nursing labor and the weighty stigma attached to the women who were hired to perform it. As historian Kathleen Brown has noted, we often only see washerwomen in the military archive because they were admonished for washing soldiers' laundry too close to tent sites and drinking water. Otherwise, we don't really get a sense of the labor that they were doing. Similarly, Washington's general orders are riddled with disdain for the women following the army. He frequently complained about their encumbrance, repeatedly forbidding them from riding on baggage wagons. Numerous regimental orderly books accuse women of enticing men to desert or stealing resources. We don't get a particularly positive picture. Likewise, the hospital department's only surviving outline of the responsibility of army nurses emphasized that they were never to be disguised with liquor and threatened severe punishment if they should attempt to steal from, conceal the effects of, or otherwise defraud the patients. The value of their labor to the survival of the army went unacknowledged until it was in shortage, at which point women unwilling to care for wounded soldiers were accused of idleness. In their occasional appearances in the military records of the Continental Army, nurses were overwhelmingly portrayed as a disorderly gaggle of lazy, drunk, dishonorable, unreliable, and unrefined women. Ooh, it will change at some point. So why do we need to know about nurses? I will continue. So these stereotypes have had a strong impact on the way that nurses are portrayed in Revolutionary War history. Often when I tell people I work on Continental Army nurses, they say like camp followers, or awesome, or like, weren't they all prostitutes? I've seen these kinds of narratives replicated even in history of nursing books written for student nurses as their training. Some of the major nursing textbooks in the United States provide inaccurate summaries of nurses' role in the Revolutionary War as kind of a prelude to triumphalist accounts of professionalized nursing in the 19th century. One claims that army nurses did little more than cook or serve meals. Another one claims that blundering assistants called mates were the only help that surgeons had. I've put these books up here as a shout out because these are 4 historians who do talk about nurses in a really valuable way, and I use them extensively and highly recommend all of these books. Holly Meyer in particular has been meticulous in demonstrating, first of all, that camp follower was a 19th century term which more deeply entrenched derogatory stereotypes about the women following the army. It wasn't used as a term in 18th century records. But secondly, she's also laid out the distinction between women in the army community and nurses hired by the hospitals. The former were rationed and subject to the same army authority as soldiers, and the second were independently contracted and in theory paid for their labor. They weren't always, because the army is not great at paying everyone on time or ever. The confusion between the two is really understandable, as Continental Army leaders, as I said, did eventually start impressing and blackmailing soldiers' wives to work as nurses, but only because they'd been so unsuccessful in recruiting willing civilian volunteers at the start of the war. So in these sort of archival moments where we occasionally see nurses' presence, we're rarely allowed access to the texture of their personal experiences, the exhausting and mundane, often unpleasant nature of nursing, and the near constant demand for their labor. In consequence, the social, military, and political implications of their grueling work are easily overlooked. But I argue we need to know about nurses purely because they're a group of participants in the war that we still don't know much about. Even when people tend to be more interested in the experience of soldiers, nurses were interacting with the soldiers, shaping their experiences of the war and vice versa. The nursing care received by wounded soldiers in the days, weeks, and months following their injury could be the difference between life and death or temporary or permanent disability. Their story is also crucial to the history of the medical profession. I found that physicians' active removal of women's medical contribution from the archive of the Revolutionary War is part of a longer history of the professionalization of medicine and the dismissal of women's generational, domestic, and community healing expertise. In fact, the military archive reveals that Philadelphia physicians who ran the Continental Army Hospital Department actively used their military positions to establish themselves and professionally trained physicians more generally as the default medical authorities in the New Republic. But more at a sort of more general level, in military history terms, women's refusal to perform care labor for the army and their resistance to the coercive efforts directly contributed to the severity of the wartime health crisis, as we can see from Washington's letter at the beginning, directly affecting the direction of the war. So we need to understand really why women were reluctant to offer their care labor. I don't know if I can. Oh, thank you. So yeah, we saw from Washington's letter at the start that by 1776, the army was really struggling to recruit enough women to work as paid nurses in the military hospitals. In order to understand their reluctance to work as nurses, we need to understand the context of early American care networks, who was performing what kind of care and why, as well as the reputation and stigma around nursing as a paid occupation. In devising their medical structures, American army leaders adopted the occupational models and hierarchies of the British military hospitals with minimal amendment. But the healthcare environment of the American colonies differed significantly from Britain, both in its reliance on unfree labor and the dominance of informal community care and vernacular medicine. For poor and unfree caregivers, performing intimate and arduous nursing care for the army in the absence of kinship ties or reciprocity was nothing new. For middling and elite women, though, who generally perform nursing care only for members of their own community, choosing to nurse sick and wounded soldiers meant substantially increasing their exposure to disease and redirecting care away from their own communities. In attempting to impose the demands of a British military hospital upon colonial American care networks based on kinship ties and community-based reciprocity and coercive labor regimes, the Continental Army created a perpetual shortage of willing caregivers. Could I have the next slide, please? So in late colonial British America, the vast majority of healthcare took place in a domestic setting. This meant that there was a considerable overlap between different aspects of caregiving labor and some flexibility in who performed what. Medical care could involve diagnosing illnesses, prescribing and administering medicines and treatments, surgery, and assessing recovery, among many other tasks. By the 1770s, the colonies had developed a unique configuration of Britain's medical marketplace. The absence of long-established British-style professional guilds allowed the practice of medicine to proliferate, unregulated among licensed and unlicensed practitioners alike. Even as Edinburgh-trained American physicians like John Morgan, William Shippen, Benjamin Rush, I think, worked to establish their medical authority in Philadelphia and other urban centers from the mid-18th century onwards, they continue to face competition from local women healers and apprenticeship-trained community doctors, commercial surgeons, druggists and apothecaries, and traveling merchants offering treatment. Partly as a consequence of the ubiquity of illness and injury in the period, most women could often manage the treatment of minor illnesses and injury in this period without specialist assistance from licensed medical practitioners. The domestic responsibilities of a housewife included basic healing and medical care. Most family recipe books included recipes for medicinal remedies inherited from previous generations, the local community, or popular medical advice books. In rural environments where agricultural and hunting accidents were common and physicians were scarce, much of the medical care required by the wounded of the Revolutionary War would not have been beyond the capabilities of lay healers and housewives. Nursing care connoted a distinct set of labor tasks linked to medical and social care, but with slightly different labor configurations. The etymological roots of nursing are in child rearing and breastfeeding, and the nursing as a form of labor remained definitionally vague, even as the verb became increasingly associated with care for the sick. Sick nursing specifically revolved around and responded to the bodily condition of a sick or injured patient. Often described as body work, it could include intimate labor at the patient's bedside and custodial labor affecting the patient's environment. Like healing and child rearing, nursing was a key aspect of women's domestic and community responsibilities, embedded in intricate local care networks based on a combination of kinship, reciprocity, and obligation. Most early American women regularly performed nursing and social care for their families, friends, and neighbors. Women were routinely called to watch or sit up with an ailing relative or neighbor. The unpredictability of illness and infection necessitated close monitoring day and night, but bedside nursing also formed an important social function, binding communities together in intimate spaces and creating ties of reciprocity that underpinned community care networks. Though there was more fluid overlap between healing and nursing in domestic and community settings, this didn't mean that all early Americans readily engaged with every aspect of caregiving. In fact, white women's accounts of their own care work tend to obfuscate the diverse structures of social hierarchy and coercion that allowed them to delegate the more unpleasant or mundane nursing tasks. Intimate body work could be performed by women of any social status, but there's abundant evidence that the dirtier tasks tended to fall to enslaved, indentured, or precariously employed servants who did not have the same kinship ties that motivated free caregivers. Even middling households harnessed the domestic labor of maids where they could afford it. Bound by economic hardship, indenture, enslavement, or social obligation, female servants routinely interacted with people's bodies, bodily fluids, soiled linens, and chamber pots with limited power to refuse, much as they might try. In both the northern cities and the southern plantations, early American care networks were deeply embedded in and facilitated by coercive labor regimes. Next slide, please. Because of this reliance on unfree labor, many of the more mundane and dirty aspects, as I say, of nursing were associated with servants and the poor. Especially in early American cities, being paid to nurse outside of kinship ties and community exchange carried a weighty stigma associated with race, class, gender, and sort of legal status. Nurse, as an occupational title rather than a verb, already had a long history of denigration and low status inherited from England, early modern England. The earliest consistent use of nurse in relation to sick nursing rather than breastfeeding was in poor relief settings in early 17th century England. Where patients lacked kinship-based care, local parishes hired nurse keepers or just keepers to monitor and assist them with their basic bodily and environmental needs, including feeding and laundry. From these early stages, hired nurses' proximity to bodily fluids put a ceiling on the respectability available to them. The majority of intimate and custodial care that they performed centered around expelled bodily fluids. As a result of their direct interaction with patients' soiled bodies and linens, early modern nurses inherited the plethora of denigrations faced by laundresses and sex workers at the time. Nursing labor was so closely aligned with laundry that many early poor relief institutions hired the same women to wash and nurse. They were kind of seen as interchangeable. Laundry was skilled and physically demanding labor, requiring such strength, space, and time that in urban environments, even households of modest means tended to wash collectively or in a neighborhood wash day, or send out their linens to a laundress. In doing so, they relinquished a level of privacy. Soiled linens could reveal pregnancies, affairs, incontinence, menstruation, illness, but the value of cloth meant that they couldn't be disposed of lightly. Nurses and laundresses therefore had an intimate knowledge of the bodies of those in their communities. Perhaps as a way to manage this loss of control, early modern English culture leaned into the portrayal of laundresses and nurses as untrustworthy and immoral. The stereotypes particularly attached to nurses played easily into early modern understandings of women's bodies. When nurses were younger, unmarried women, often preferred by medical institutions due to their lack of existing family commitments, their interaction with strangers' bodily fluids and necessary knowledge of the body was perceived to signal their sexual experience. Popular culture conflating nursing with sex work was common. This wasn't always without basis because wages tended to be so low that many poor women were forced to seek additional income. But then when nurses were older, married women, they shared with midwives an assumption of embodied knowledge and experience that permitted their interaction with bodily fluids. However, their experience of menstruation, childbirth, breastfeeding, and incontinence could also be read in line with early modern grotesque representations of women as leaky vessels, unable to control themselves. Stereotypes of the drunken, untrustworthy matron quickly proliferated in popular culture and satirical prints. I've got a couple up there. Their relative economic independence and geographic mobility perceived as just as transgressive as the young nurses assumed to be sexually promiscuous. As English poor relief turned increasingly to charitable hospitals in the 18th century, their rules and regulations emphasized discipline and containment for the hired nurses just as much as their patients, based on the assumption that they would be coming from a similar social class. So the subordination of hired nurses was so intrinsic to early institutional healthcare that these stigmas crossed the Atlantic pretty much unscathed. Upon establishing the first charitable hospitals in colonial New York in 1736 and Philadelphia 1751, their American founders modeled their staffing and labor structures on the British precedent. Both institutions were closely associated with the city's almshouses, offering low-cost or free medical treatment to impoverished patients. In return for their practice, the Edinburgh-trained American physicians enjoyed total medical authority within the hospital, a rare reprieve from competing with lay healers in the local medical marketplace, and enough of a foothold for professionally trained medical men to preside over American institutional healthcare indefinitely. As in the British model, the American hospitals only employed women in custodial roles as washerwomen, cooks, or matrons or nurses, all subordinate to the male physicians and managers. British anxieties around institutional nurses mapped easily onto the existing anxieties about women's wage work and geographic mobility in New York and Philadelphia. In the Pennsylvania hospital up there, nurses were often single immigrant women, young single immigrant women, many of whom had required the support of the hospital or nearby almshouse themselves. The hospital's first patient, Margaret Sherlock, was, quote, cured and hired as a nurse after her admission in early 1752. Wages were low, ranging from £10 to £20 per annum between 1752 and 1770, compared to £50 to £70 per annum for the hospital's cell keepers and stewards. A gender differential even lower than the one half to 2/3 that accompanied most women's wage work in cities in this period, and well below a living wage. By the time of the Revolutionary War, these British-influenced hospitals of New York and Philadelphia were still outliers within a diverse, majority rural colonial healthcare environment. In most cases, in most regions, local care communities were robust enough that outside of institutions, nurses were only really hired independently in times of health crisis, like epidemics. At Mount Vernon, I heard that George Washington only seems to have gone out of his way to hire a nurse before the war in in 1760 when smallpox broke out among the enslaved population, and he couldn't risk exposing enslaved nurses to the disease. I haven't tracked down yet how much he paid her, but it's unlikely to be a generous wage. And it's some indicative evidence that he was bringing some of these same stigmas about wage nursing to the Continental Army. Unfortunately for the Continental Army and its sick and wounded soldiers, the women they hoped to recruit were acutely aware of the delicate line between reputable and disreputable nursing, and generally reluctant to take the risk. Moreover, nursing labour performed outside of their own reciprocal and community-based care networks was not an appealing prospect. When Margaret Hill Morris attempted to send one of her servants to care for her sick aunt, the young woman resolutely declared that she will not go to anyone as a nurse. Morris prevailed upon her to stay a few days, but advised the aunt that the girl must not be called a nurse, even if her labour was essentially the same. In the relatively few cities with established hospitals or poor relief institutions, nursing was among the least appealing forms of wage labour for women. The charitable and semi-carceral status of almshouses and early hospitals made them especially undesirable workplaces. Pennsylvania Hospital had a perpetually high turnover of nurses and likely lost most of them to jobs with less risk of contagion, slightly better wages, and more reputable domestic settings. The few nurses who did remain at the hospital for multiple years were those with obligational or familial ties. Some, like Margaret Sherlock, were former patients, paying off an actual or assumed debt. Some, like Elizabeth Weed, were the wives of the steward or the cell keeper. Unless civilian women had similar ties to the army community or male hospital employees, they had little incentive to nurse in a military hospital. Change slide, please. Thank you. So the staffing model adopted by the Continental Army Hospital did nothing to challenge the fears of American women that nursing was neither reputable nor valued work. In establishing the department in 1775, the Continental Congress had diverged from early American healing traditions and closely followed the example of British military and charitable hospitals. Many leading physicians in the department had either studied medicine in Britain, practiced at the Pennsylvania Hospital and New York Hospital, or served in the British Army during the 7 Years' War, so all brought with them strongly entrenched ideas about the gender division of labour in institutional and medical settings. Surgeons, surgeons' mates, and apothecaries were the only salaried positions that carried any medical authority to diagnose, prescribe, operate, or prepare remedies. According to the only list of staff responsibilities that we have, nurses were responsible for the cleanliness of the wards and patients, changing linens, emptying chamber pots, heating and cooling, providing assistance with toileting, washing, and feeding. Matrons, ideally the wives of the steward or ward master, like in the earlier hospitals, were to, quote, superintend the nurses, bedding, etc., and similarly carried no medical role. Revealingly, the only circumstances in which they were permitted officially to administer the medicine and diet prescribed for the sick was in the absence of the mates. In the mates, by the way, didn't need any qualification, anywhere near the qualifications that the surgeons needed. And so it was a similar level of custodial and nursing labor that nurses would have been carrying out, but with more explicit medical aspects. But again, without the medical training that they were told that physicians would need. In the original hospital plan authorized by Congress, surgeons were to be paid $1 1/3 per day, mates $2/3 of a dollar per day, and nurses paid 1/15 of a dollar per day, or $2 per month. This formal structure made it abundantly clear that medical labor outstripped nursing labor in both rank and value. The influence of British military medical practice on the Continental Army was so profound that in July 1776, hospitals were instructed, quote, that in all cases not provided for by the foregoing, the surgeons and mates will observe the customs and usages of the British Army, like the italicized British, just to emphasize it. Crucially, following the British model allowed the Continental Army to entrench a professional medical hierarchy that only reflected a portion of mostly urban early American healthcare structures and didn't map on at all to the rest of the American healthcare landscape. By explicitly separating professionalized medical practice from custodial nursing, the hospital department rejected more capacious understandings of women's healing work and embraced a tradition of wage nursing rooted in stigma, subservience, and perceptions of unskilled labor. Also baked into the British hospital model was a deep-rooted suspicion of the class of women willing to work as nurses. Like most adverts for wage work, those appealing for nurses sought humane, industrious women who can be recommended for their honesty. However, the regulations and disciplinary measures set out by Congress outlined a much more extreme disciplinary regime. Congress emphasized the subservient rank of nurses with the severe warning to, quote, never be absent without leave from the physicians, surgeons, or matrons. Their direction to, quote, deliver the effects immediately of such soldiers as die in hospitals to the wardmaster was immediately followed by a threat of severe punishment for, quote, any attempt to steal from, conceal the effects of, or otherwise defraud the patients. This language seems to have been lifted almost directly from British Army surgeon Donald Monro's observations on the means of preserving the health of soldiers, published in 1750, which formed the basis of most British medical policy. The assumption of nurses' criminality also clearly exhibits the genealogy of this particular model of nursing in poor relief institutions. In fact, Margaret Pelling, a historian of medicine in the UK, has argued that the enduring association of English early modern nurses with theft was a byproduct of their original responsibility for end-of-life care and relatives' instinctive suspicion of their efforts to seek payment from a patient who had died. The full collection of early modern nursing stereotypes seem to have crossed the Atlantic, just like they did in the earlier institutions, including the powerful image of the slovenly and drunken nurse. Among their list of custodial responsibilities, Congress ordered Continental Army nurses to, quote, keep themselves clean. They are never to be disguised with liquor. The consecutive and slightly awkward placement of these particular clauses amid a list of otherwise unrelated responsibilities strongly resembles Monro's directive that nurses should keep themselves clean and decently dressed and to observe the strictest rules of sobriety. You can see the side-by-side comparison up there, further indicating a direct British influence. Drunkenness was apparently a consistent problem among the soldiers, with orders and reprimands issued against it throughout the war. Liquor was particularly accessible in hospitals as it could be a key aspect of medical care, but nurses were the only hospital staff explicitly warned against drinking it. So these imported suspicions of nurses were compounded by the deep discomfort that characterized army leaders' relationship with the rank-and-file soldiers and women in the army community. George Washington, in particular, was consistently unsettled by the rough manners and appearance of the provincial soldiers, whom he described as exceedingly dirty and nasty people, upon his assumption of command in July 1775. His repeated orders that officers, quote, impress upon soldiers the necessity of frequently changing their linen, reflect the necessity of cleanliness to manage the spread of disease, but also his determination for the army to project an image of discipline and respectability. If a man's virtue could be read in his bleached collar, soldiers in soiled linen sullied the ideals of the revolution itself. Equally threatening was the prospect of lewd women associating with the soldiers, which is often a phrase that is used frequently. Throughout the war, Washington was overtly concerned with the character and reputation of the women in the army community. In 1780, officers at West Point were ordered to submit returns of the women and children during rations in each brigade, specifying whether the former are married or unmarried, as well as the reputation or employment of those within the limits of the garrison. As Kathleen Brown has noted, army leaders' tendency to suspect hired washerwomen of sex work and dubious morality directly conflicted with their desperation for clean linen. Unable to reconcile this contradiction without marching an essential workforce out of camp, many officers found more moderate ways to control laundresses, such as regulating the rates they could charge in case of extortion, in case they were extorting the soldiers unfairly. The intimate nature of nurses' labor left them equally vulnerable to army leaders' disdain. Persistent shortages of cloth meant that sick and wounded soldiers often lay naked on their beds of straw, sometimes even without a blanket to cover them. In addition, nurses' constant interaction with soldiers' wounds and bodily fluids must have made it nearly impossible for them to keep their own clothes clean as directed. While laundresses' arduous and smelly labour was ultimately masked by the virtuous clean linen that they produced, the image of nurses' labour was inextricable from their contact with strangers' bodies. The work itself rendered nurses unable to meet the standards of middle-class white femininity and modesty, and left them vulnerable to the same contempt and patriarchal surveillance faced by poor single mothers and sex workers in cities. While being here, I was chatting to various people, and I've got a real sense that Washington, in particular, was always really concerned of the appearance of different workers on the Mount Vernon estate, and issued different qualities of clothing for different workers depending on their visibility. And that's something I really want to think more about and dig into more deeply, because I think it really speaks to this sort of preoccupation with image and how different virtues can be the sort of balance between like the usefulness of labor and the virtue of your appearance while performing that labor. So if anyone has any suggestions of sources there, much appreciated. It's notable that when soldiers were harshly reprimanded on multiple occasions for bathing in public ponds and running naked to the houses of nearby civilians, army leaders' primary concern was for the potential, quote, insult and wound to the modesty of female decency. It almost goes without saying that Washington and his genteel peers did not consider army nurses equal to these ladies of the first fashion, but their evocation of modesty as a condition for womanhood suggests that nurses' care for soldiers' bodies had already wounded their femininity beyond redemption. In the daily tussle between the army's moral image and the labor necessary for its survival, army leaders remained deeply uncomfortable about their dependence on women's intimate care work. I'm running slightly short of time. I do have a whole section about the working conditions of hospital and contagion, but I'm going to skip it. And if anyone wants to ask questions about that in the Q&A, happy to talk about it. There was a lot of contagion and epidemic, as I'm sure you can imagine, which did not make the role, it sort of further made the role unappealing to potential volunteers. Just as a quote to sort of underline this, if nurses did get sick, they received little guarantee of reciprocal care, the care that they were performing for the soldiers. At one point during the war, Dr. Joseph Young had to write to hospital director Jonathan Potts to ask, if a nurse be employed and takes sick, are they entitled to nurses' wages during their illness? So there was a debate about whether they would even be paid for becoming sick in the course of their labor for these soldiers. So their health was clearly an afterthought. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the Continental Army's struggles to recruit and retain nurses persisted for the remainder of the war. The few hospital returns that include nurses indicate that numbers of the employed nurses remained grossly far from the intended quotas. In the Philadelphia hospital in 1779, one matron and one nurse were recorded to care for 133 patients. By the end of the war, 7 matrons and 30 nurses were spread across 7 hospitals. Rather than investigate the cause of this shortage, other than like issues with pay, army leaders tended to blame the women themselves. In a moment of desperation, Washington suggested in 1778 that nurses be enlisted for the same wages as soldiers, for he can, quote, no longer bear having an army on paper and not have them in the field. But this proposal was never taken seriously, whether or not he meant it seriously himself. James Craik seems to have interpreted it as hyperbole, venting his frustration to Jonathan Potts. Quote, I wish some method could be fallen upon to employ women that can be depended upon. In truth, the hospital department could rarely be depended upon to pay nurses their promised wages. In 1780, Dr. Bodo Otto, the Director General of the hospital at Yellow Springs, complained to the Continental Congress that the hospital staff had not been paid for 7 months, nor had they been provided with any clean clothes. According to Otto, they had reached their limit. He said, the nurses and orderlies refused serving any longer as they received no pay. I find it incredible that they continued working for 7 months before then, having not received any clothes as well as the pay. For the remainder of the war, the Continental Army's methods of recruitment became increasingly coercive as leaders turned to women with existing ties to the army. Even before the Battle of Long Island, Philip Schuyler had ordered, quote, 1 woman from each company of the Pennsylvania battalions at Ticonderoga to be drafted as soon as possible and sent to the General Hospital at Fort George to nurse the sick. By 1778, this was apparently standard practice. At Valley Forge, Washington ordered regimental commanders to procure as many women as could be prevailed upon to serve as nurses. As I mentioned earlier, Holly Meyer has been careful to distinguish between camp women who temporarily or intermittently cared for sick and wounded soldiers with their companies or regiments, and nurses who served in the hospital, employed independently. But the confusion between these two groups is reasonable, considering the number of camp women who were impressed as hospital nurses specifically because of their status as retainers. Unlike employed nurses who had never enlisted, generally lived locally, and could theoretically leave at any time, camp women were members of the army community and subject to military discipline. Many were soldiers' wives, far from home, often with children, and unable to support themselves outside of the army. They received their rations under the terms set by the army and could lose access to subsistence and their husbands if they refused to provide labor. Washington's general orders regularly reminded that camp women that their presence was precarious, ordering officers to, quote, permit no more than are absolutely necessary and such as are actually useful to follow the army. Women's usefulness was explicitly tied to their performance of custodial labor. Regimental orders for the Northern Army ordered that, quote, any woman belonging to the regiment who will refuse to wash for the men shall be immediately drummed out of the regiment, as their receipt of victuals was not to distress and render the men unfit for duty, but to keep them clean and decent. By 1778, it seems that useful had also come to denote the provision of nursing care specifically. From White Plains, Washington conveyed his frustration. I cannot see why the soldiers' wives in Albany should be supported at public expense. He argued that feeding camp women when they should be working amounted to robbing the public and encouraging idleness, concluding that if they would come down and attend as nurses to the hospitals, they would find immediate employ. As the army prepared to leave Camden in August 1781, leaving behind all the sick men unable to march, orders again specified that a sufficient number of women, particularly those who have children, must be left as nurses. Camp women were at once an encumbrance and a valuable source of vital labor. So in conclusion, the Army's reliance on women for essential nursing labor clashed with inherited cultural perceptions about women's wage work and custodial and intimate labor. Despite the undeniable need for skilled nursing in a wartime environment where soldiers faced disabling injuries and illnesses, the Army consistently failed to acknowledge the value of nursing labor and those who performed it. Marginalizing nurses and relegating them to low-status positions not only hindered the recovery of soldiers, but also entrenched a professional medical hierarchy that valued male medical labor above female nursing labor by default, which continued then into the United States medical profession and practice from the 19th century onwards. So just a final thought, how does the perspective of nurses alter our narration of the nation's founding as we approach the 250th anniversary in a year and a half? I think this moment is particularly unique as we're preparing for this anniversary in the wake of our own health crisis, multiple global pandemics, during which we've all had to reckon with the value that we place on particular different types of labor. The spike of appreciation for care workers and like essential workers was short-lived in the sort of 2020 period and rarely manifested in livable wages or better working conditions. We're now in a world, I'm finding, that wants to move on and not really think about the pandemic because it was deeply traumatizing for all of us. While I've been doing this work, I can't help but make comparisons when reading about the creation of the Revolutionary Archive and the role of medical labor and nursing in the Revolutionary Archive. There's a visceral sense of a nation in the aftermath of the revolution wanting to commemorate the political crisis and move on as quickly as possible from the health crisis and not acknowledge the sort of bodily suffering and in doing so, not acknowledge the people that were responsible for caring for those sick and wounded soldiers. But it is unavoidable that the care labor provided by nurses, civilian and army community, underpin the activity and health of revolutionary actors across the social spectrum. But they're rarely considered in our commemorations of the war. So I'm particularly excited for 2026 as an opportunity to recognize the crucial role of health and nursing in the Revolutionary War. And I hope that that is something that that Mount Vernon is leaning into as well, and very excited to see it. Next slide, please. That is everything I have to say. Does anyone have any questions?
Meg, are any of the books that you mentioned available in the gift shop here?
Ooh, in the gift shop. Yeah, great. There's I think so. There's another one. Holly Meyer edited a volume called Women Waging War, and that is definitely in the gift shop. Most of those books are in the library. As far as I already have my own copies that I've pulled apart, but I've noticed that they're in the library. So yeah, I highly recommend all of them.
Well, I hope you'll be able to come back here in 76.
Me too. Thank you very
There's
much.
always 20.
Hi, sorry about that. I have the honor of sharing an office with you. So even though I have a million questions, I'm only gonna like say like one and a half. Actually, one is just sort of a question, but maybe an idea if you haven't yet looked into it. But I just recently read that Martha Washington was fully at camp with George Washington like a half of the war.
Yeah.
So I mean, that last slide seems especially hypocritical if she wasn't herself volunteering to do nursing care work.
Yeah.
And then the other sort of, I guess, question is, I'm fascinated by the link to drunkenness, because as a literary scholar, my brain immediately went to Jane Eyre, where kind of all of the inciting action is the drunk nurse who falls asleep on the job. And so I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on where that part of the stereotype comes from. Do you think it was racial? Is it just classist? Yeah, and I think I'll leave it there so other people have time to ask stuff.
Fantastic. Both really interesting questions. Oh my God, I'm gonna need to control myself talking about Martha Washington at camp because I have thoughts. But what I find particularly interesting, I've got a whole section in my dissertation about the sort of memory making of caregiving in the war. And there's a really interesting case that, who is it? Someone who's written a book about women at Valley Forge has done some deep investigation into the myth that there is a very powerful myth that Martha Washington at Valley Forge actually cared for sick and wounded soldiers, and she absolutely did not. Like, there is no way. Like, when you look at all of the evidence, there is no way that she was anywhere near. She may have sort of done a tour of the camps and spoken to and comforted sick and wounded soldiers, but what's she called? Nancy Lone, I think she's called, a fantastic historian who's gone through every mention of this myth and sort of the creation of this myth across the 19th century, and it comes down to different interpretations of comfort. And so, like, she comforted the soldiers, and sort of it's the sort of whisper effect of, like, it starts off as like she visited and comforted soldiers, and then it turns into she cared for soldiers. Like, it becomes this massive myth that is grounded on nothing. So highly recommend that that kind of myth making analysis in, I think it's called Following the Drum, the book, Nancy Lone's book. In terms of drunkenness, yes, I think it's complicated in its kind of transference between England and early America, because I think it becomes a lot more racialized here. I think in England, it starts out in the kind of like Gin Lane, class-based, unreliable mothers and like drunken mothers, and sort of it's the sort of lower class women who are not performing motherhood in the correct way, there's also a lot of stigma around wet nursing and the type of women that will offer to wet nurse children or like be paid to wet nurse children. Again, I think it's anxieties about wage labor. And obviously when that transfers here into, there's a lot of wet nursing especially in like urban centers and on plantations, like it becomes so much more imbued with racial stereotypes. So I think it's the class and the race sort of dimensions of that are sort of grow out of each other, but develop quite separately.
Hi, Meg. Thanks so much for this. A comment and a question. Comment, I can't help but think of Jane Boydston's pastoralization of housework, which of course contributes to this growing sense of a division between private and public, and the ways that this labor is assumed not only to be gendered, but not to be worthy of wages, right? And the kind of gendered hierarchy of labor that's evolving alongside this. So clearly you've also thought of that, but that's just something that was really emerging for me. Question was, I know that there are many debates happening about drafting or impressing enslaved people into the Army. Is there any discussion of enslaved women being brought in as nurses?
Right, so that is something that I have a strong instinct that there was, but I haven't found any evidence for it. So it's the inevitable historian experience of just being like, I feel like the vibes are pointing me this way, but it's not. I can't confidently say that that's what was happening, because there are enslaved women being impressed, or like especially when officers bring like enslaved people to the camps to do sort of domestic labor for them. Sometimes there's a bit, when there's like extreme shortages, you definitely see enslaved women and enslaved men as like orderlies, sort of performing a lot of the custodial side of the labor. I haven't found anything explicitly about nursing and like intimate body care, but it would not surprise me, because I've got my sort of first chapter is about like establishing the kind of labor regimes of caregiving, like on the eve of the war, and nursing labor, like where in areas and households where there are enslaved people, or enslaved women, they are the people doing that kind of labor. So it would not surprise me. It just is really hard to find. So again, if anyone sees anything, I've kind of trawled through all the Valley Forge records, because I feel like that is where they were most at sort of crisis point in needing more of a workforce there. But I need to look elsewhere, I think.
Happening at state level, actually not just in the Army itself, but in South Carolina or in Georgia.
So they're not in relation to the official Army structures. As far as I've found, there's definitely cases where the Army will convert someone's house into a hospital, and then the soldiers are cared for by the enslaved people at that house. And that is talked about in a kind of at a local level, and it's sort of factored into the Army's capacity to care for. They are kind of slightly more casual about recruiting nurses in the South, because they know that there's so much more of a population that they can sort of draw upon. But it's not, by that point, the sort of formal structures of the hospital, they're just looking to other regimes. They're looking to other ways of finding nursing or nurses that aren't relying on the kind of the sort of wage work environment that they are in the sort of northern settings. But yeah, I will look more into that, because I think I need to delve more into the sort of state records and like how they're talking about it. Thank you.
Hi,
Hi, Meg. Thank you so much for a fabulous talk. I've really learned a lot. I wanted to ask you about learning to spin here at Mount Vernon. I wanted to ask you about sort of what that experience was like for you, what questions it's raised for you, and maybe also, given your really sort of fascinating conversation about archival silences, have you found that material culture, that sort of objects and understanding what it feels like to do this labor has been helpful for you in kind of combating those silences?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. I didn't put it in this presentation because it's not so much in this chapter, but the rest of the dissertation is like deeply involved in the material culture of care, because it is essential, because there is this archival silence. And in sort of previous years, it's been like going where I did a month at Colonial Williamsburg and just went around being like, show me the chamber pots, like it just sort of this sort of crazy person. And they were like, yeah, sure, because they're all really into that. Yes, it's a crucial element, and learning to spin I was so excited. Sarah Marie, who taught me how to spin, is here, and it's just so visceral, because you do it. I think the main influence it's had on the way I think about this labor is the time that it takes, because the nurses weren't spinning, but they were sort of quite often, especially when housewives and sort of domestic servants were performing nursing labor, they were doing it alongside all of their other household responsibilities, which included every stage of making sort of clothing and material and stuff like that. And it just does take so much time. And it kind of explained the archival silence to me in a way, because there just isn't time when you're doing when you're starting from scratch from so many things. Even like I spent some time in Philadelphia trying to map where a household's privy was compared to where the building was, and how long it takes to get down there. And if you're carrying a chamber pot full of stuff, you have to be really careful. There's also a real fear about falling into privies because they're really unstable. Like the sort of mechanics of it, I think, are absolutely crucial to this work. And it's something that in the hospital setting, I'm trying to work out in terms of there's occasional architectural plans of hospitals, and sort of seeing how it's how big the spaces were, is really helpful in just trying to visualize it, and the sort of materials that they had available, or lack of materials. The sort of blanket, I'm really fixated on blankets, because they just had a constant shortage of blankets. And one of the main ways that the army had beef with the Quakers was because they were trying to impress their blankets, and the Quakers were saying no, we need the blankets to get through the winter because everyone's going to get ill, and the main way to kind of flush out a fever is by piling by sweating it out. So the quantity of blankets you have and the quality of blankets that are really crucial. So it becomes a real zero-sum game that the army is navigating. So that I could talk about this forever, so I'm going to stop myself. But thank you for the question, because it is something I'm thinking about a lot. And I also am it was one of the reasons I was so excited to come to Mount Vernon, because I was like, there's incredible resources in the library, but also I just wanted to get a real sense of the kind of labor and the sort of what goes into sort of living a life in, and sort of making different environments function in early America.
Any further questions? Let's give a big round of applause.